Alright, in this video we're going to be covering the economy. We're going to be going over startups, political economy. We're going to tie a lot of this stuff into, a broader theory, a broader reactionary political worldview. Specifically, we'll be looking at Peter Thiel's theory of progress in the economy, which is interesting, and I'll be looking at some of his other stuff as well in a future video, but today I'm mainly going to be focusing on his theories of progress. And Nietzsche and Bickler's book, Capital as Power, I'll sort of be integrating those two, which, combines into a nice political economic theory that fits into generative anthropology pretty squarely. So, starting off, this series of videos I'm going to be making is all going to be focusing around Peter Thiel's theory of political economy. So, looking over what that is, he talks about most of this in his book 0 to 1, which I just read the unedited lecture notes for, which was the basis for the book, and he starts off both of them by talking about the vertical-horizontal divide. So, basically, Peter Thiel does not see all progress as created equal. He sees some progress as fundamentally intensive and some as fundamentally extensive. So, take, for example, Apple inventing the iPhone. That's a kind of invention that permits a sort of scenic, a change of environment entirely around this new technology. It opens new avenues by going, as Peter Thiel calls it, from 0 to 1. Within that technological field, hence the name of the book. That's vertical innovation, that's vertical progress. Horizontal progress is not like creating a new technology, like the iPhone. Horizontal progress is more like globalization. It's like expanding hydropower in China, or, bringing Ford to Japan, something like that. Horizontal progress is fundamentally taking things that already exist and either making them better, or more accessible, or accumulating them, stuff like that. And when you divide development into these two sectors, it's pretty obvious which one people tend to pay lip service to and tend to opt for. People tend to prefer vertical innovation. People tend to prefer technology over globalization. Now, not everybody, and even for those people who do really think globalization is the way to go, the Great Reset people, even they admit most of the actions they'd like to take development-wise themselves will at one point have to be predicated upon a new technology. The example Thiel gives in his book is, let's say you want the whole world to have a car. Let's say you want everybody on the planet to have a car. Well, you could theoretically phrase that as a horizontal problem, but it itself would be predicated on getting this vertical thing out of the way where we just don't have the oil for that. We don't have the gas for that. So you would need to develop and make accessible, in a vertical way, a sort of car. Keeping in mind the book was written in 2012, so this was not as widely available back then, an electric car, a car that is using fuel that is not derived off natural gas or fossil fuels, stuff like that. So that's one example of a horizontal change, kind of being predicated on a vertical one, but generally we're just assuming people prefer technology over globalization. And that vertical-horizontal divide, it's pretty much real. It's not just, phrasing. It's not just a continuum thing. It's a fundamental difference in the sort of action you're taking. It's an ontological difference rather than just, an arbitrary delineation across a continuum of sorts of development. It's really a fundamental sort of a difference. The qualitatively vertical, the qualitatively technological, or intensive, or 0 to 1, versus the qualitatively horizontal, or extensive, or 1 to n, moving from that already existing technology to some superior state within that scene that's already been created, right? So, we've got that division out of the way, and then that brings us to kind of an ancillary point in the book, but one that I'll circle back to later, where Peter Thiel talks about different modes of competition in the market. He talks about how in economics, people perceive of essentially two extremes. People perceive of monopolistic competition, where, we understand what a monopoly is. There's one firm or very, very few firms that dominate the market, and it's price non-competitive, stuff like that. And on the other side, and most people won't know about this, there's perfect competition. Competition, a market in a sphere where there's infinite, undifferentiated products sold by infinite firms, each of which make no profit. They have a profit margin of 0%, and equilibrium is reached instantaneously. And for economists, for almost every economist, at least in older times, it was thought that perfect competition was sort of the default state, or at least the desirable state of a completely free market. And, people reason around that a lot. People talk a lot about perfect competition. They pay lip service to it. But, Peter Thiel sees that continuum, and he does not assign the typical normative value that people do in their everyday lives, where, monopolies are just bad because they're non-competitive, and perfect competition is good because, it's competition. Rather, the way Peter Thiel sees it is that monopolies do prevent horizontal competition, obviously. Take, for example, back when Microsoft were like the big dog in operating systems and that sort of stuff. With Windows, you couldn't just make another operating system to compete with them, try and improve upon Windows. That wouldn't be feasible. They would just shut you down. However, we did see that Apple, with the iPhone, again, that's a vertical development, and that actually did partially overthrow Microsoft's monopoly when it came to computing. So in that case, we see sort of what Thiel is getting at. Monopolies do prevent horizontal competition. You couldn't just make Windows 2.0 and try to sell it. That would be infeasible as a market strategy. But a company, Apple and, several others could have done this. You can do a vertical competitive product. And in fact, monopolies are, he goes further, not just conducive to vertical competition, like in that sense, in the sense of Microsoft and Apple, but furthermore, they're inherently the consequence of vertical development, of vertical innovation. That is to say, the default state of a vertical firm is monopoly, until it's overthrown by either competitors eventually or a new and superior technology. And why do we think this? Well, it's kind of obvious if you look at the past, right? Of course, Microsoft are sort of the first to make the product that they're putting out there, the personal computer operating system and the enterprise operating system. They were the first to make it feasible, technologically feasible. And for that reason, they became a monopoly pretty much instantly, but we saw the same happen with Apple as well. In fact, Apple actually patented the technology for a touchscreen on a smartphone at the outset, and Samsung, etc. They did get sued for using that technology, for using the touchscreen later on. So Apple was a monopoly to begin with, and you see this pattern reflected anywhere if you look at truly vertical, innovative 0 to 1 developments in history, developments in technology. Unless it's a totally public venture, it tends to be that the product created is sort of monopolized instantly, which is itself, again, conducive to more vertical change, more vertical innovation, which people tend to prefer. So Peter Thiel really gets rid of that normative, negative association on monopolies that people tend to have in their minds, and he gets rid of that positive association with perfect competition. In fact, in the unedited book, he talks about how even calling it perfect competition is sort of like an economist's fantasy. It's not really perfect, it's just extreme. He calls it insane competition is probably the correct term, or infinite competition, or extended competition, something like that. And really, it's not even close to perfect. I mean, Peter Thiel has a quote in the unedited book where he says, perfect competition means constant equilibrium, and in business, equilibrium means stasis, and stasis means death. The moment when you kind of go into that point of stasis, there's no more vertical creation happening on the scale of the market. And, he extends that to a whole view of monopolies as sort of natural and beneficial. But I've been going over that for quite a while now. Just to recap, we got vertical and horizontal development, and then monopolistic and perfect competition. Those are the two main things that Peter Thiel talks about that we're going to be looking at in integration with Nietzsche and Bickler's book, and furthermore with Generative Anthropology. Moving from there, let's look at Nietzsche and Bickler's theory. Let's look at their book. Now, I will do a more thorough overview in the future. This is going to be a pretty rough look at it. It's going to be kind of rough around the edges. I don't want to spend too much time on it because the main focus here is, Peter Thiel and how it connects into generative anthropology, but they posit that capital is not really a material productive thing. It's not just a reflection of stuff out there in the physical world. And that when you think of capital as just stuff out there, just material productive stuff, you have to invent this distinction in neoclassical economics called the nominal real distinction. You may have heard of this if you look at maybe the history of inflation or the US budget spending. You may see people refer to nominal versus real numbers. And the implication there is that the nominal, the money value, is less meaningful than the real, the value in terms of like products or capital goods, because the former is just about like finance. It's just about the literal currency being swapped, and the latter is about what capital supposedly fundamentally is, which is products and material production, productive faculties, stuff like that. In this neoclassical worldview, where everything is sort of every capital good, all capital comes down to material productivity, that distinction makes sense, and in fact it's necessary. And Marxists have something very similar, Marxism being probably the largest, at least the oldest contender to neoclassical economics, yet in Nietzsche and Bickler's view, not a particularly strong one. I mean, the view that labor is the fundamental structure doesn't get you away from that problem. And furthermore, Marx explicitly does call finance fictitious capital, which is the same sort of obfuscation that the neoclassicists need when they invent that nominal real distinction. Both of them have the fundamental misconception that capital reduces down to material productive stuff in the real world, and that it's not a social element, that capital is really a tangible material thing, fundamentally. But Nietzsche and Bickler and myself, we dispute this. I would posit, as they do in their book, that capital is a social element. Capital is primarily what they would call the nominal, and the real, or the productive faculties of capital, are sort of an epiphenomenon of the more fundamental structure of the social element that is capital, which is power. The whole name of Nietzsche and Bickler's book is Capital as Power, because they view capital as one reflex of a larger system, a larger power structure, divvying out power or handling power, that larger power structure being capitalism itself. And this solves a lot of issues. It's a really well done book. I'm not going to handle it for too long, but we can just have the understanding for now that they view capital as a social element. All social elements are predicated on and subject to power, so capital is ultimately derived from power in their worldview. And this makes a lot of sense. I mean, everybody understands that the economy really often affects politics. We have NGOs, we have think tanks, everyone understands lobbyists, some individual donations, those are kind of rare, but furthermore, the inverse is something else that people don't deny as well. The monetary policy of the Fed, the fiscal policy of Congress, they all obviously affect the economy. So people get that there's a level of public-private, maybe miscegenation is the right word, a little bit of mixing between the public and the private, and that perhaps even there are some institutions like the CIA, which are somewhere between public and private, but lean public, and institutions like Palantir, which are somewhere between public and private, but lean heavily private. People are beginning to accept, and people have accepted for actually quite a while, that the public-private divide is more of a continuum than a real qualitative distinction. And Nietzsche and Bickler explain why capital and power are really deeply ontologically connected. Capital is predicated on power. Capital is a power structure. It's not a reflection of real material circumstance. Real material circumstance is, as they argue in their book, itself predicated on power, obviously. But I'm not going to go too deep into capital as power. I will in a future video, but for now, let's kind of, think of how Thiel plays into this, of how 0 to 1 plays into capital as power. If we're accepting that vertical and horizontal development are fundamentally different kinds of economic actions, and I think you have to, in any economic theory, then let's see how we would represent that in this worldview where capital is a form of power. Well, I think the correct way to phrase it would be to say that vertical progress creates new categories of power. It creates new varieties of power, whereas horizontal progress just works with those existing frameworks of power created in some vertical circumstance to accumulate or use produce or procure that power within that framework, right? I mean, this is a pretty trivial conclusion when you combine these two theories, which are, there's some contradictory parts to the broader theories, but fundamentally the main ideas of capital as power and the main ideas from Peter Thiel's book integrate pretty nicely to show that there's these sort of innovative technological changes which create entirely new frameworks within which power can be procured, entirely new power structures and new categories, varieties of power, whereas horizontal progress is only accumulating power within those prefabricated settings, right? So, and this ties in pretty, really nicely to generative anthropology. And for those of you who don't know what GA is, I have done a video in the past discussing it a little bit, and I'm probably going to do a more comprehensive or focused one in the future, but for now I'll sort of explain minor pieces as I go. GA is sort of fundamentally predicated on the idea of scenes and the scenic element of human representation, which is to say, people are sort of contextualized in the actions they take, right? Everything you do, every action you take is predicated and sort of pregnant with a larger social context behind it, and that social context has an origin, right? An origin point. That's what generative anthropology is more broadly studying, the origin of humanity and how it connects to human development over time, right? So, that's a pretty broad term. It's kind of obvious. Yeah, people are contextual in the way that they act. Everybody basically accepts that. But applied to that specific phrasing I made earlier of vertical progress as procuring new forms of power and horizontal progress as being, the accumulation, procurement, usage, application of power within those, pre-made scenes, within those pre-made settings, yeah, the word for that would be scene. We could apply the word scene to that circumstance. That is to say, we could say vertical progress is creating new scenes here. It's the origin of a new scenic form of representation. And subsequently, horizontal progress would only be optimizing, extending, or appropriating within those scenes. And this just seems like a terminological change, but really, it does change quite a bit, because it allows us to draw analogies between GA and, how companies tend to develop and how Peter Thiel sees the development of companies, and there's more than a few similarities. I mean, of course, it's not complete coincidence, because Peter Thiel's largest intellectual influence is René Girard, and so was Eric Ganses, who was the originator of generative anthropology as it is presently. But the coincidences, they go deeper than just René Girard. It feels like they're really getting at something fundamental here, wherein, in generative anthropology, there's a view of power proceeding from this originary scene, the scene at which humanity began. And, essentially what's going on in that scene is, hypothetically, all these humans are referring to this one object, right? There's kind of a center-margin relationship where the object being referred to is this center, and all the humans congregating around it are the marginal, sort of referring to it. And I'm not going to get into all of GA right now, but essentially what they see is that you can look at really serious anthropological accounts of the origin of authority and the origin of power and kingship in human societies, and you start to see patterns, which the generative anthropologists sort of abstract into, all right, we've got this center, we've got all these humans referring to these concepts, sort of, in this early originary circumstance. And at some point, somebody basically appropriates that center. Somebody occupies the center. And the occupation of the center is essentially the origin of power in generative anthropological thought. Now, how that all works, I'm really simplifying. I can't really get into it too deeply, but subsequently they see a continuum that power goes through, which, we see in serious empirical anthropological accounts too. There's a period of sacral kingship where the human who's occupying the center, the person with power, is seen as kind of connecting to a broader, an almost heavenly world and ordering Earth, ordering the kingdom alongside that heavenly world. And then you see that get replaced with divine kingship, which starts to see ancillary power structures emerge, and then there's the axial age, where kingship sort of breaks down. It's predicated on super sovereigns, which, is Adam Katz's term for stuff like human rights or liberties, stuff that is above sovereign, above the center, judges of legitimacy, one might say. You see this kind of a continuum happen with political power, this continuum happen with people occupying the center, and therefore, taking away the generative anthropological speak behind it, people with power. And that same continuum is lived out by startups and by firms and by markets. For example, if we're agreeing that vertical progress is creating these new scenes, right, then we could also say when the company becomes a monopoly right after, well, it's occupying the center of that scene. Again, sort of the details of that are sort of complicated, but we kind of get the general schema behind it. When you're a monopoly, you're occupying the center of the market. You sort of distribute out prices. Prices become less like conforming with the market and more like a command from the center. Stuff like that. And then you see a point where other companies start to emerge. This is what Peter Thiel sees when companies move from vertical to horizontal development. When you move from vertical to horizontal progress, as Microsoft did when they were sort of, quote-unquote, dethroned by Apple, that opens you up to, being taken out by that vertical innovation. Even if you are a monopoly, you're not free from vertical innovation as a fear by the time you've switched from vertical to horizontal progress yourself. And we saw that for Microsoft. At the point of being overthrown, they had stopped doing real innovation. They were just taking the scene that already exists and sort of minorly improving it as the center. And then we see this procedure happen afterwards where, just like in generative anthropology, this center starts to become sort of prototypically weaker. And when that happens, there start to be contests to power, contests to occupation of the center from within and from without. And, just like Adam Katz identifies in anthropological accounts, these companies tend to undergo a similar kind of dethroning to what you see in the axial age. You start to see, these occupants of the center get dethroned by other concepts, and new scenes start to emerge to accommodate those new concepts. Again, not getting too deep into it, but that whole process is mirrored perfectly, or very, very well at the very least. It's at least a very good analogy, a very close analogy to what you see in anthropological accounts of kingship. And what this implies is, pretty deep. When you connect it with capital as power, it's essentially companies are living out mini kingships, mini patchwork kingships. So yeah, overall, that's the broad thing that I think is useful, when integrating all these theories. We have Peter Thiel talking about vertical and horizontal development, monopolies, and you can rephrase capital as power, relying on Nietzsche and Bickler's book, and basically get to that point where you're saying, okay, vertical progress, you're creating new categories of power. Horizontal progress, you're, creating power, using power, stuff like that, accumulating within those pre-created settings. And then we get GA. You can use some GA phraseology here and call it a scene. You're making new scenes in the vertical sense. And you're not making new scenes, but you're working within the scenes in the horizontal sense. But then furthermore, once you start to do that, you see too detailed these similarities. These companies getting basically, kind of thrust into centrality, thrust into kingship almost as a monopoly, and then gradually as they shift from vertical to horizontal development internally, start to get contests from within and without, and then get deposed eventually either through direct competition, which we do see sometimes, or more frequently actually through a new scene being created through exogenous vertical innovation, vertical progress, and that dethroning the previously held, monopoly by weakening the scene itself, essentially. I'm going to be doing more videos on Peter Thiel, on capitalist power, and definitely, generative anthropology in the future. This is kind of a detailed video analyzing one view of these theories from one angle. To test the waters, I'm going to be doing more focused stuff in a while, though. I'm definitely going to make a video covering capital as power on its own. That might be the next video I make, but for now, guys, cheers. Have a good one. Gonna be back doing daily videos, so see you tomorrow.